Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridharadhari. 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 Yashodanandana Bhajana Ranjana. Yashodanandana Bhajana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. 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 Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridharadhari. Jaya Gopi Jana Vallabha Giridharadhari. Yashodanandana Bhajana Ranjana. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Yamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. 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 Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare. Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare. Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurum Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Darati Swapadantikam Vandeyam Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sajajatam Sahana Raghunatam Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakamitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So welcome to our Friday discussion. So we'll be discussing today from chapter 13. I think last time we discussed verse 30. 31 we did? Yeah. Okay. So we'll be doing verse number 32 then, and maybe 33. So hopefully everybody is feeling charged up from Gaur Purnima, the wonderful mercy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Gauranga Mahaprabhu, is running very strong amidst all of us. He has given us this wonderful process of devotional service. So we'll read the 32nd verse today in the purport and then discuss a little bit. So, read 32.
Those with the vision of eternity can see that the imperishable soul is transcendental, eternal, and beyond the modes of nature. Despite contact with the material body, O Arjuna, the soul neither does anything nor is entangled.
Report.
A living entity appears to be born because of the birth of the material body, but actually the living entity is eternal. He is not born, and in spite of his being situated in a material body, he is transcendental and eternal. Thus he cannot be destroyed. By nature he is full of bliss. He does not engage himself in any material activities. Therefore, the activities performed due to his contact with material bodies do not entangle him.
Okay. Let's read 33 also. So it's a short report for both of these.
The sky, due to its unsuitable nature, does not mix with anything, although it is all-pervading. Similarly, the soul situated in Brahman vision does not mix with the body, though situated in that body.
The air enters into water, mud, stool, and whatever else is there. Still, it does not mix with anything. Similarly, the living entity, even though situated in varieties of bodies, is aloof from them due to his subtle nature. Therefore, it is impossible to see with the material eyes how the living entity is in contact with this body and how he is out of it after the destruction of the body. No one in science can ascertain this.
So, Krishna is continuing to give good knowledge about the position of the soul within the body. Okay? So we know that this body, Krishna defined earlier on, is a kshetra. It is made up of all these material elements. And what else is residing within this body?
The soul.
The soul and super soul. So we have Jiva and Paramagma, right? And Krishna earlier has explained that the Jiva and the Paramagma, are they the same? No?
No.
What is the differences between the Jiva and the Paramagma?
The soul is part and parcel
Of
Krishna.
Krishna. And what is Paramagma?
Krishna.
Krishna. An expansion of Krishna, right? So Krishna said earlier that the Jiva is subordinate to the super soul. And so subordinate means it has this relationship of service. One serves the other, right? There's a master and servant. And that is an eternal relationship. But when the Jiva becomes confused by its position, it then enters the material world, right? It enters these bodies. So in the just prior verses, Krishna said, when a sensible man ceases to see different identities due to different material bodies, he sees how things are being expanded everywhere. He attains to the Brahman conception. It means when a realized person sees a dog, a human, a tree, an insect, they see the spirit soul within everything, right? So they know that the spirit soul is of quality, it's the same, but it has a different body. Right? And what is the cause of its different bodies in this material world? What is the cause of the Jiva taking different bodies in this material world?
Different karma. Past life activities.
Different karmas, different activities lead to different bodies, right? So based on one's actions and desires, material nature gives a particular type of body to the being. Right? So the body is, Srila Prabhupada Krishna himself gave the analogy in the second chapter, that changing of bodies is like changing of clothes, right? So when we change our clothes, we take on a new one, and a new one. So when we are interacting with people, we understand there's a person behind the clothes. We don't just see the clothes. We see that there's a person. So similarly, one who is self-realized, they don't see the bodies of the individuals. They see that there's all living entities, part and parcel. So in this verse, Krishna is saying that those with vision of eternity can see the imperishable soul is transcendental, eternal, and beyond the modes of nature. So the question becomes, when the soul enters the body, does the soul become contaminated by the modes? Right? Just like if you submerge some, a white cloth into a color of dye, a cup of dye. What happens to the white cloth? Does it remain white?
Picks up the dye.
It picks up the dye, right? And it becomes colored. So the logical question then is, when the living entity enters into the material world, does it also pick up the material nature? No? Okay. So what is Krishna telling us here between this verse and the next verse? How do we know that the soul does not pick up the qualities of the material nature?
Well, in 33, it talks about basically air or the sky, so it doesn't mix with anything, and the soul is also subtle, or soul spiritual and stuff. So, if a bubble in water, right, is still air. It's not mixed with the water, or like inside a mud or stool or whatever is there. The air pocket is still air. It doesn't change, or it doesn't mix, no matter what it's inside of. So similarly, like the soul, even if it's in the material world, it doesn't mix.
Okay. So Krishna says it doesn't mix, right? So let us kind of understand why it doesn't mix. When I put that cloth into a cup of water with dye, we know it picks up the dye, right? So why does the soul, when it enters the material universe, why does it not pick up the conditioning of the material energy? Because the material energy is all pervading. Can you escape it anywhere? Just like if you jump into a swimming pool, can you escape any corner of the pool from being wet? It's pervasive in the whole realm, right? So the material energy, the material creation is like that. Its presence is everywhere. So how is it that the soul remains uncontaminated?
The spirit and matter doesn't mix with each other.
So the soul is made up of spirit. You said it was. You said where does the soul come from?
It's part and parcel of Krishna.
It's part and parcel of Krishna. So its composition is spirit, because Krishna is all spirit. We know when Krishna descends into the material world, he remains uncontaminated. Krishna established that, and he said, fools deride him when he appears, thinking that he is some ordinary person. But just as a king, when he goes into the prison house, the king does not become subject to the laws of the prison, because he is the king. Similarly, when Krishna enters into the material world, he does not become subject to the laws of nature. When he grows, he's not growing by the force of time. He grows simply because he wants to. When he appears, he's not appearing by the force of material nature. He appears because he wants to. And when he leaves when he wants to. So we know Krishna is not subjected to the modes. He is transcendental to the modes. He is the controller of the modes. Okay? So in as much, Prabhupada will give example, as the clouds can never cover the sun, the material nature can never try to capture Krishna. So we know that about Krishna. So then when we break it down now to our spirit soul, it has the same dynamic. Right? Because we are part and parcel of Krishna. We are made up of this spiritual energy, this superior spiritual energy, right? Para and Apara Shakti, Krishna established in chapter 7. So the soul, by nature, by definition, then cannot mix with matter. It cannot be touched by matter. Krishna established that the soul cannot be cut, it cannot be burned, it cannot be withered, because these are all material elements. Right? So the soul remains untouched. So the soul remains untouched, then what does that mean about the nature of the soul eternally?
That it's also eternal and if it has the same properties.
So it's also eternal. What else? If it's never touched by matter,
Cannot be contaminated.
which means it's always
Pure.
pure. So the soul is always pure. It is never contaminated. So when we say, I'm searching for purity, I'm trying to purify the soul, actually we have to add a little bit more to that statement to make it actually accurate. Because can you purify the soul?
No, it's already purified.
The soul is always pure, 100% uncontaminated. So what are we purifying then?
Consciousness.
The consciousness, yes. And so we have a consciousness we have to purify. What else?
Heart.
The heart. What gives us the jiva, the consciousness that it's this body, that it is part of this material world? The false ego. So the soul is, when it comes into the material world, immediately covered by the false ego. The first covering of the soul is the false ego. And as soon as the false ego is present, the consciousness deems, I am this body. That is the meaning of false ego. False means untrue. Ego means I am. Untrue understanding of who I am. Right? So as soon as there is false ego, the soul begins to perceive through its consciousness that I am this body. Okay? So when we talk about purifying, what are we actually purifying? The false ego. We are breaking down the false ego. We are removing the coverings of the soul. Okay? So when we say then that a pure devotee of the Lord, they are in a liberated state even within the material world. I think, how can that be? Right? How one can be in a liberated state within the world. It's like how one can be inside the pool and not become wet. Right? So now how can that happen? Understanding the nature of the soul. How is one's consciousness of the pure devotee driven? Is there any false ego present? Is there anything contaminating the pure consciousness of the soul?
Pure devotee has removed or purified their consciousness or their false ego so that it's not covering of the soul, so that spiritual qualities shine through.
So Rupa Goswami establishes just Jiva Mukta. Even in the embodied condition, one can be liberated, meaning the soul is fully, always pure, but the conditionings, the coverings of the souls, when removed, even within the material world, one can find its pure state. Right? So the devotee doesn't see the material energy even as something to be afraid of or resentful of, or he sees or she sees the material energy as an energy of Krishna. And thus, how one can use that energy in the service of Krishna. So the pure devotee who has removed the conditioning is not in the least bit bewildered by the material nature. They simply understand how to utilize the material nature in the service of Krishna. Everything is an opportunity to serve Krishna. So because the soul is always pure, then we can understand that yes, even one can be a pure consciousness within the body. And thus, when there is no false ego, one's mind, intelligence, and senses are also fully purified. Right? So one's mind is full of spiritual thoughts. One's senses become spiritualized. They're no longer conditioned, right? And that's why the verse Rupa Goswami quotes in the beginning of Nectar of Devotion, he says that when one engages in devotional service, one of the side effects is the material senses become purified. Right? So this is the position. So when we know that the soul is always pure, we should have great faith that actually, our path to purity is not so far. It's not like once you have a cloth that was white and now has accumulated red dye, how difficult is it to make it pure white again? Difficult?
Yep.
Very difficult.
Very
right?
difficult.
Each and every fiber of that cloth that's intertwined has now absorbed that red dye. Right? But if I have a diamond with some mud on it, how difficult, if I have a bucket of water, how difficult is it to remove that mud and regain the pure diamond? It's easy?
Very easier.
Quite easy, right? Because the diamond is never touched or contaminated by the mud. It's simply covered. It's simply covered. All we have to do is soak a diamond in the mud for a few seconds and all will come out, and what will come out? Come back to pure diamond. So the difference is that because the soul is never touched by material nature, our path to perfection is straightforward. Simply follow the teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Simply by chanting the holy names of the Lord, we can eradicate the covering, the false ego, which is the mud covering our soul. The soul is always pure. It's never become contaminated. It's always retained its purity. And because it's retained its purity through all these years, millions and millions of lifetimes in the material world, regaining that purity is simply a process of knowing how to remove that mud, how to remove that covering. That's it. And so Krishna is giving us great confidence that one who sees this nature of the soul being this eternal, they understand everything that Krishna says that despite contact with the material body origin, the soul neither does anything nor is entangled. So it remains in an uncontaminated. It's simply along for the ride. As long as one is driving its decisioning from the perspective of the material mind and intelligence and senses. So these two verses gives us great confidence that though the soul is present throughout the body, we can very easily attain our pure state because it's never become contaminated, it's simply become covered. And so what did Chaitanya Mahaprabhu tell us in Shikshashtakam, how to cleanse the mirror of the heart? Cheto Darpana Marjana. He said one of the benedictions of chanting the holy names of the Lord, it cleanses the mirror of the heart. It removes the coverings of the soul, so that the pure consciousness can quickly emerge again. And so this is the important understanding that our soul is still fully intact, remains pure, because spirit never mixes with matter. As Mataji was saying earlier, it never mixes. And the second conclusion is that we should understand with great clarity that a pure devotee of the Lord, though has a material body, is not materially conditioned. And Prabhupada writes in Srimad Bhagavatam that one should not observe the pure devotee of the Lord, thinking, oh, because there's a material body, they're also materially conditioned. We know that no, there's a pure soul uncovered by the false ego residing in the heart. And yes, there's machinery in the body. It may get a fever. It may need rest. Doesn't mean that the body itself becomes eternal and spiritual. It has a material nature. But the soul within, the consciousness of that person is still purified. So one must not judge, and Rupa Goswami tells us in Nectar of Instruction that one should not judge the material body of the pure devotee. Remember that from Nectar of Instruction, right? So now we know why. Because the pure soul residing within the body is in its pure state for the pure devotee. So that's and Prabhupada answers the last question, or makes a statement at the end, which is really nice. No one in science can ascertain this, right? Science is trying to figure out, how to make the body eternal, right? Science, what do they believe about life? What is their theory of life?
Ends with the body.
It ends with the body. And where does it come from?
Matter.
Yeah. It's a random combination of material elements. But all the material elements are present, but unless the living force, the living entity is impregnated into the universe, there's nothing. Matter will not move, it's inanimate. It only moves by the presence of the living entity. So, science will continue to try to create life, right? There's so much effort to create life in laboratories. And if you read Srila Prabhupada's comments, in some of his purports, he speaks about this. And scientists are claiming they're very close to creating life. And he wrote those purports 50 years ago. And are we any closer to creating life in the laboratory? It will never happen. But they thought 50 years ago we were very close. We're just on the verge of creating life. But it will never happen. Right? So Prabhupada rightfully says no one in science can really ascertain this. Okay? So these are the sources. So let's read 34 also. That way next week we'll finish. Yes.
Okay, so for 33, like that sentence right before it, therefore it is impossible to see with materialize how the living entity is in contact with this body and how he's out of it after destruction of the body.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not like scientists trying to discover the soul coming in and out of the body. Okay, I don't know, I was kind of confused by that one.
So it's impossible to see with material eyes. Right, so with my material eyes, I cannot see the soul leaving the body. Right, like I remember somebody told me once that they had done a study and they had weighed the body just before death, and then after death the soul left and they could see some perceptible weight difference. That's not proving the soul, though technically the soul is left, because no material instrument can measure the weight of the soul, right? So the material eyes cannot see. So the materials, the scientists say, prove it to me, show it to me, show me the soul. Right? But the soul can be seen. It can be seen, but not with a material apparatus. It cannot be seen with material eyes or material intelligence. It must be seen with spiritual eyes. So the soul can be seen, and that's why Krishna said earlier that one who has a spiritual vision, he sees the soul residing in the hearts of every living entity. Yeah. The Uttamadhikari, the topmost devotee, they see simply the soul. And so Prabhupada is saying so it's impossible with the material eyes to see how the living entity has left the body. Right? So scientists will say the person died. They'll say the heart stopped working. They'll say the brain stopped working. But they'll not be able to ascertain why. Why? It's because the living force within that body is left. That's it. The living force, when it leaves, the body will immediately become inanimate. Because it is only the soul that is giving shape and energy, movement to the body. Just like a car. Until you get in the car and drive it, it will just sit in the driveway. It won't go. It needs a driver. Right? But the scientists, they can only see the car driving. They don't see the driver moving the car. And that's the...
And when the material is like absorbed in red dye, like, because all our minds are being absorbed constantly with things around it, right? So, and we're surrounded by material things, so it's very easily absorbed into the mind. But then the protection of that is what Srila Prabhupada gave us, like the chanting and everything like that.
Yeah, I mean that you're taking that example to a different point, which is really powerful. That just like that piece of cloth, it very easily picks up the dye. When it comes in contact with it for just a moment, it picks up the dye. But now to remove that dye is like impossible, very difficult. So similarly, our mind is like that. Our mind picks up things in the moment's association with matter. But once it's in the mind, to get it out is very difficult, very arduous. And thus, if we want to protect that piece of white cloth, what do? We make sure it doesn't come in contact with any dye. So we protect it. So similarly, we should protect our minds. Not let our minds see anything and everything. Not let our minds hear anything and everything. Taste anything. Because whenever it makes contact with matter, those dye, those impressions are being made. And then to get them out is much difficult. But by the mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he has given us the best bleach, the most potent bleach, right, to cleanse. And that is a chanting of the holy names. But while we are cleansing, we must be very careful not to let the mind come in contact indiscriminately with matter. Because as you said, once it's in contact, undoing that is very difficult. Very difficult. Okay. Maybe we'll end here. Any comments? Huh?
Going to 34.
No, I think we'll have it.
Sorry.
Yeah, and then we'll do that. We'll do 34 and 35 next week. We'll conclude chapter 13. Any other questions? Yeah.
You used two examples, right, Prabhu? One is diamond covered with the sand, and one is the cloth covered with the dye. So for the mind, we are using that example.
It's more the cloth.
For the soul, to understand that one, we are using the cloth.
Yeah. Because the mind is subject to becoming contaminated. The soul cannot become contaminated. And so one is a porous substance, one is not. If you think about it in scientific terms, right? A porous object has the ability for something to enter into it. A non-porous solid object cannot. If you stick a piece of solid steel into that dye, it won't, because there's no place for it to enter. Right? So the mind is a sponge. It picks up so many things. Because the mind that we have, it's a material element. Right? Our intelligence is also material. Our senses, they're made up of matter. Right? Like, what is this eye made up of? It's matter. It's all matter. Right? It's different elements. That's what the eye is. The tongue. Right? Different elements. So these are all material.
So it gets mixed up.
So it can become contaminated by matter. Now, the living entity, as it purifies its consciousness, it can then purify its senses and spiritualize its senses. And ultimately even spiritualize the body. And that is why, the great devotees, the great acharyas, we don't cremate their bodies. Because we've understood that they become fully spiritualized. And thus they rest in samadhi. But they don't, because their bodies have become fully spiritualized. So even this material form, by the potency of devotional service, become fully spiritualized. But even in that end, Prabhupada writes that it'll still have its symptoms of matter. It'll get sick. If you cut it, it'll break. It's not like it'll become indestructible all of a sudden, right? But we understand that the body has become fully spiritualized as one becomes very pure in its devotional service. But until then, yes, it's subject to contamination from matter, because it is matter. That's the difference. The soul is not matter; it is spirit, and thus it cannot be touched by matter. It can simply go around it, but it cannot penetrate it. It can go in all circles of it. You can submerge it, but it won't penetrate. Just like a diamond, if you put it in water, water cannot enter into the diamond. Right? It's a solid substance. So like that. And that's the point that Krishna is making here. So simply we are removing the covering of the soul, not purifying the soul. And the reason the consciousness of the soul doesn't permeate, because the consciousness of the soul is always in bliss, right? It's ananda. It's chit, full of knowledge and eternal. So like that diamond, there's no sparkle coming from the diamond when it's covered in mud. Right? It can't present itself because it's covered. So similarly, the pure consciousness of the soul, it's subdued, though it's there, because it's covered by a substance. And as soon as I remove that substance, the pure consciousness begins to shine through. Just like a light bulb. If I put a heavy cloth over a light bulb, I'll not see light. But if I replace it with like a thinner cloth, I'll begin to see sunlight. Right? So as we remove the coverings of the false ego, some of the pure consciousness begins to emerge. But that light is still shining, even if it's covered by the cloud. It's just not perceptible. So it's just another way to think about why the consciousness doesn't permeate the pure consciousness. Why is it this conditioned consciousness? Because the pure consciousness of the soul is covered. And thus it takes on this contaminated consciousness. Make sense?
There's a question.
Yeah.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, when we say all the souls are the same, which means all have to be seen equally the same. However, in our lives, if we treat our family, our caste, our country, etc., which means we are still covered with material nature. Is the understanding correct, Prabhu?
Yeah. Who's asking? Huh? Yeah, Hare Krishna Prabhuji. Yeah, so it's a great question. If we see designations of color, we see designations of caste or any type of designation, male, female, rich, poor, those are all material designations, right? So that's why Krishna says that, the sage, he sees the Brahmana and the dog with equal vision. He sees the spirit soul within. Now, it doesn't mean that one is blind, that there is a difference between a Brahman and a dog. They see that that living entity has acquired the dog body due to a greater degree of misuse of its independence. And the Brahmana has acquired the Brahmana body due to a lesser degree of misuse of its independence. So the one who sees understands the cause of the difference in the body, but understands that the spirit soul within is the same. So it doesn't suggest that everyone's the same. No, there are different levels of conditioning. There's a different history for each and every living entity. So it's not that every living entity is the exact same in the sense it has its exact same course. No, each soul is independent and individual. And that soul, through its body, makes various decisions. And it takes a path. But ultimately, the one with pure vision sees that still within that is the living entity who is part and parcel of Krishna. But its path has deviated it more or less based on the types of bodies that it has achieved. So that's how one sees. So one does not judge or discriminate based on the type of body. And that is why the devotee, when we say, that we care for all the citizens of a country, the devotee doesn't care for all just the human citizens, all living entities. They're all citizens. Right? They're all living entities. All part and parcel of Krishna. So one's love is much expansive, not just to one's family, not to just one's nation or societal group, but to all living entities, human and not human. Because the spirit soul is present within everyone. Any other questions?
No. So like when we come to the process and, we take initiation and start our devotional life and so forth, we're still quite contaminated, but we're going through that process of purifying. Hopefully we'll get to that point.
Yeah, initiation is the beginning. You're initiating the process. It's the beginning, not the end. It is the start of one's determined progress in devotional life. One has become convinced that this is the only means to success, and one has become convinced they need help. These two things. But that's just the beginning to start. to bring about this consciousness. So even in devotional life, we tend to have this conditioning. We judge people, we judge devotees by their bodily designations. And Rupa Goswami says, don't do that. That is very dangerous for your devotional life. We still carry with us the bodily designation, even though we become initiated. Right? Until we truly see ourselves living in this body, in the city of 90 gates, as much as we see ourselves living in the city that we live, it must become that clear. Then we'll stop with our designations. So we should recognize that yes, we do have those. We should be aware of them and work to slowly, remove them. And that's why in devotional service it's so critical that when we make our own decisions in devotional service, we'll be bewildered because we're contaminated. So our decision-making process is skewed. So that's why working under the instruction of the spiritual master is so essential. And that's why Mr. Chakravarti Thakur says fixed intelligence means fixed intelligence in the order of Guru. Vyavasatmika buddhi, that is real determined intelligence. So then what we're seeing through our conditioned lenses doesn't matter. If I'm simply following the instructions of Guru, then I'll be safe. But if I follow my own vision, it's cloudy. I'll be in trouble. Make sense?
Yeah. Interesting watching those remembrances. Like so many of the Srila Prabhupada's disciples talked about the power of following Srila Prabhupada's instructions, and the second they thought something different or did something different or didn't follow, the immediate effect of that was so pervasive on them and stuck in relevant, like immediately they were able to, you're straightened out or you got out or something happened. So
Prabhupada writes in Srimad Bhagavatam in a very, very straightforward statement. He says, it is not devotional service unless it is following the instruction. That's a strong statement. It is not devotional service unless you are following the instruction of someone. That is the means of devotional service. So we may think, I'm going and doing devotional service. But unless it is coming under instruction, Prabhupada writes, it is not devotional service. Because as soon as it's coming from my own understanding, my own ideas, I'm conditioned. So then, of course, it's not devotional service. It may look like devotional service. It may look like bhakti, but it's not. It is only bhakti when it is following the instructions. It's black and white. And that's why when the Guru gives instructions, not only is there instruction, but there's the mercy, the potency to complete that instruction is also there. When we follow our own whims, we're on our own. We don't have the mercy to complete that. But when it comes under guidance from the spiritual master, then the potency to follow it also is manifest. So, yes, the devotees in the early days of the movement, they're very innovative and energetic and idea-driven. Right? So naturally, there'll be some, ideas. This was in the formation stages of the movement. So lots of ideas, and sometimes, things would get done without the, sanction, and it's a great experience. It's a great experience for us to fall on our face when we try to because why? We'll learn this is not devotional service. But don't think that happened in the early days and now it's not. It happens equivalently now. because the false ego and Maya are very strong. Very, very strong. So it happens just as much now. So we should be very wary and cautious of that. And if we are, then devotional service becomes very easy. Very straightforward. There's no worries. Anything else? No. So we chant?
Yep.
Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki
Jai.
Ananta Kuti Vaishnava Vrinda ki
Jai.
Jai.